This week's show brought to you by Austin Rivers. Seriously, man. WTF. Welcome back to the Boxscore Geeks show. Last show of 2015. I'm in the right year, Brian? No time
Hopefully.
travel?
I'm
All
usually a
right.
few years behind, Dre.
All right, yeah, I always get numbers and stuff confused. It's very tropal of me as a software engineer, but yeah, I get numbers and names confused in my head. Good thing I don't write about numbers and names all the time. Anyway, this is the Box Score Geek show. Might have a long show, might have a short show today. We've teased short shows in the past, and they end up going long, so we'll see what happens. We only have two tentative topics on the docket today. I'm your host, Ray Alvarez. You can find me on Twitter as Nerd Numbers. This show, as always, is produced by our own voice of God, Brian Foster, who you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Say hey, Brian.
How's it going, Dre? And yeah, like I said, I got nothing to say today, but I'm sure I will anyway. Maybe it'll be a
I,
short
I don't
show.
think we're going to be talking the Warriors, and I have yet to see a time on the show where we bring up the Warriors. If you're not sick of them yet, people, it's not our fault. I mean, give me
They're
a
getting
break.
hammered tonight so far, Dre. Last I
29
was
and 1.
looking.
Well, they don't have Curry in, right?
Yeah, Curry's out
Curry is out.
tonight.
So to date the show, apologies on this ahead of time. I did a tease before the show opens, if you listen to the intro, where I asked about Austin Rivers. Austin Rivers went off in a game tonight. You know, if he's going to drain like his first three threes in a row, he'll look like a good player. He's not, but still. And then, of course, the Warriors are playing tonight without Steph Curry, so that makes it all the more timely that I brought up that I thought that they should beat the 96 Bulls. That's one of our subjects. So tonight, Brian, I'm going to let you decide. We have two subjects. We basically have the truthiness of concussion and the 96 Bulls versus the 2016 Warriors. Which would you like to start with?
Let's get into the Warriors. We were just talking about them. I've
Oh,
never
yeah.
could turn down the Warriors.
Shocker that you picked the Warriors first. All right. So this is just a popular trope that's coming up lately, and it's not surprising given that the Warriors are playing so well. Namely, the question being who would win in a battle, the 96 Bulls or the 2016 Warriors? Because the 1996 Bulls are arguably the greatest team in NBA history, the only team to crack 70 wins in a season. They won 72. And are just considered like the pinnacle of greatness in NBA. They're I think one of the few teams that's ever been first in offensive rating and first in defensive rating. Those two numbers being, for those of you that don't know, offensive rating is how many points per 100 possession you get, and then defensive rating, how many points per 100 possession you give up. Clearly, if you're good at one or both of these, you're typically a good team, and the Bulls were very good at both. And it goes without saying that anytime a team is really, really hot and starts breaking records like the Warriors did with their start of season 24-game win streak. By the way, Brian, my dog is not on board for the background noise. I started talking the Warriors. My dog, who has been lying in the corner for the last 20 minutes, just got up and left. He's like, you know what? I've heard enough about the stupid Warriors in the stupid room. So that's my dog Moby's take on the Warriors. But anyway, really, it gets really hard when you try and compare teams cross generation. The rules were different in the NBA in 1996. The player pools was different, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, wait, my dog's back. No, he doesn't care. I thought he was interested. He came back. He gave his thoughts. I guess he's actually going back into the corner. Exciting news, listeners, I know. But comparing cross-generational stuff gets really, really hard. But seeing this, my gut check says that the Warriors would just blow away the Bulls. And the kind of first foray into this research, and I intend to do more, or maybe we'll just talk it tonight, Brian, and I'll never revisit it again. My first foray is just three-point shooting. The Warriors this season are just absurd at shooting threes. It's just not right. And, it's worth noting that we have one of two situations that would happen. I'm curious on your thoughts, Brian. In 1996, the NBA decided to shorten the three-point line to 22 feet uniformly. If you look at the three-point line right now, what happens is in the corners, it's like straight, and then it makes kind of like a circle out around. So the corners are 22 feet, but the rest is like 23.9 feet. So in 1995, at the end of the 95 season, before the 1995-96 season, they said, let's just make the entire three-point line 22 feet. Lo and behold, teams took a lot more threes as a result and shot a lot better from threes. Not really surprising that when you shorten the three-point line, teams shoot better from threes. So that happened right before the Bulls kind of happened. So one of two things happens. Either if the Warriors travel back in time to 1996 to face off against the Bulls, the Warriors are going to have a shortened three, and that's going to make them even more deadly. Or the Bulls travel forward in time to 2016, and they have to shoot with a longer three-point line, and I think that hurts them. Additionally, in this article that I assume you've got up, Brian, with my nice charts,
The
apologies, by
chart
the
is
way.
on screen, yeah.
Apologies, listeners, for like RSS readers. I usually try and do an image and then the JavaScript on top of it. That chart is generated by HighCharts and JS Fiddle. I love both of them so much. So if you're a developer, HighCharts, JS Fiddle, really your friends for developing good-looking charts quickly. But anyway, I usually put a picture behind, so like if an RSS reader doesn't run the JavaScript, it'll pop up. Apologies, I forgot to do that this week. So if you don't know what charts I'm looking at, see if you can hop on a machine with JavaScript. If not, I'll just fix it next time. But basically, what I showed is I was like, the Warriors, if you just look at three-point shooting, that first line, they are absurd. For those of you wondering, the diameter of the circle is basically what I call net points, the combination of shooting efficiency and volume. So when you combine both volume and shooting percentage, the Warriors, shooting 42.3% from three, and then, taking almost 30 a game is just absurd. And the Bulls, for comparison, they shot 40.3%, which is good, but that's almost 3% worse. So I had to throw you an audible, Brian, but if you recall back in the day, I did a post on like the difference between shooting efficiency and shooting volume, and basically said like every 1.5% is better than like every extra shot. So that 3% from three is absurd. And then additionally, and that's even higher if we take into account true shooting percentage, meaning shooting 40% from three, you're actually shooting much better, because that's I can't think of it off the top of my head, Brian, but it's over 50% from two by a wide margin. But so the Bulls took only 16.4 3 points per 48 minutes. And then they only made like 40% compared to the Warriors are shooting, almost 30 and connecting on 43%. So that right there is already an absurd difference. And if we compare defense against threes, the Warriors are actually the second best team, or as of 2 nights ago when I wrote this article, the second best team in terms of keeping opponent three-point shooting efficiency down. Now, they're not as good at something else that you want to do, which is keeping down number of shots. The Spurs are this perfect combination this season of both limiting three-point attempts and then also limiting three-point shooting efficiency. But basically, if we look at how good the Warriors were three-point shooting relative to their league, and then how good they are at defending relative to their league, and then do the same thing for the Bulls, it's not even close. And seeing as essentially this three-point shooting efficiency is what drives this Warriors team, it just goes without saying. Like, the Warriors win the three-point battle against the Bulls in either era in a rout, and I think that's huge.
Yeah, and this is an amazing chart, and so many things on it just kind of jump out at me right away. And first, that massive Warriors circle, of course, on the upper right-hand side of the chart. They take a ton of threes, and they make a lot of them. And that's a huge difference from last year's team, even, and why they've been playing better. I don't think they led the league in threes last year, and they don't even this year. The Rockets are ahead of them, right? This one down here.
The Rockets are fascinating because I think the Rockets show an inherent problem in the NBA versus baseball, and actually kind of are the Rockets are a Moneyball story. I come down very hard against advanced analytics in basketball because it's a joke. And I'm sorry, you'll just hear me rant. I get more and more depressed.
Oh, is this a Daryl Morey tease for later in the show?
It might be. We'll see.
We'll see.
It's not as much. This is actually a positive Daryl Morey thing, which is to say, most of the advanced stats in basketball make me sad because they're not well done. They're not well thought out. The trends that catch on are so stupid. It's not like baseball where a bunch of smart, intelligent trends that were used by successful teams caught on. Essentially compare the Spurs and the Oakland A's, except nobody's copying the Spurs. Everybody copied the Oakland A's. That's my basic thought. But one thing that Morey did that we have given him a lot of credit for was what we called Morey ball, which was, we call it Bop the Clown Nose. You named that on the show, Brian. It's my favorite offensive strategy, which is if you look at a shot chart, you really want it to look like a clown nose, which is if you look at these heat charts that show red where teams are shooting more from, you really want to see a ton around the rim and a ton around the perimeter. James Harden is beautiful at this. So that's one thing the Warriors and the Rockets have done, and then also the Spurs, of course, have done the last couple of seasons. And the Warriors, sorry, I keep meaning to say the Rockets, and I say the Warriors just because I'm looking at their chart in front of me. The Rockets took it to the extreme where they're the team that takes the most threes, the most layups, tries to get to the line the most. A lot of that's James Harden. But that caught on, and other teams are starting to do it. And the problem is now with like James Harden kind of struggling, and some other players like Corey Brewer was a joke player to get for that team. Josh Smith was stupid. Trying to do Morey ball with subpar players versus trying to do Morey ball with good players in the NBA, that's always our go-to line. To be successful in the NBA, you need good players. So that's the problem is Morey ball caught on, except the problem is Morey doesn't have the same arsenal as other teams. So I'll give Morey a ton of credit for that strategy. That's a brilliant strategy. We're fully behind it. The problem is when you have a team with Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, Andre Iguodala, who knew, Draymond Green, Harrison Barnes when healthy doing it, versus a team with Ty Lawson, who I really hoped he was going to be back, but he was having trouble last season. Corey Brewer, Josh Smith last season, those caliber of player doing
Instead
it.
of keeping guys like Tarek Black, right? We've said that many times.
Exactly.
Just
So
bad personnel decisions lately for the Rockets.
yeah, it's you can play a really good strategy with a bad personnel, and that has some hope of success if no one else in the NBA is doing it. But the one problem with the NBA is other teams have already caught on, and we can argue the Spurs have caught on. We're onto this a long time in the past. This season with LaMarcus Aldridge and a healthy Kawhi, they're stingy at defense. They're actually really reminiscent of the Bruce Bowen, Tim Duncan, David Robinson Spurs that were winning titles in the early 2000s. But for a long time, the Spurs' edge was on offense. So that's the problem is in the NBA, not only do you have to be good at smart strategy, you have to have good personnel in it because your only hope without that is that other teams will have bad personnel decisions, or no, not bad personnel, bad strategy decisions, and that doesn't seem to happen because the NBA, it's only so complex you can get. It's not like football.
Yeah, no, that's true. And, the other thing that jumped right out at me on this chart, though, is even though, like, the Rockets, we can see their kind of smallish circle there, some of these teams that are shooting worse because, and, this is the corollary, it's clear that all these 95, 96 teams shot way better at threes. Like, it just really jumps at you on the chart. All these blue circles are way higher in three-point shooting percentage than the darker blue ones.
Except for the Warriors break this chart. That's the fun part.
And then you also have the Bucks down here, too, kind of back with the low attempts. But, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And I would say it is also worth noting that something important about this chart, and I'll see if I can find a smart way to fix it on future ones. It's really hard when you try and do, if you're a developer, if you're trying to do graphic charts with area being the number you're using, like percentage or whatever, it gets really, really difficult when you get zeros. And so I'll have to do something in the future for that. But there are some teams that are even missing from this, or I think are invisible. I think if you hover over, you can see some invisible teams.
Yeah, the Timberwolves in 95, 96 are invisible. 32% threes at 10 attempts per game for the whole team.
And what's worth noting about that with the 32-10 is that means that they were according to net points, which is the denominator on that, they were negative. They were losing points on threes, and that's when there was a cheat code essentially. So regardless, all I was going to say is, the Warriors break this chart because this chart would be kind of a beautiful example of improved, how the league has changed, right? The league has started taking more threes, but in 1995, 1996, they were more efficient from threes, except the Warriors except us. So that's absurd.
Yeah, and looks like we lost Dre here. Let's see if we can get him back on the Skype call. Let's see. Are you coming back, Dre?
I am. That was kind of weird. Don't know quite what happened. What was the last thing I said?
I don't think we missed anything. It cut right out right away. So, you can keep talking.
Oh, yeah, just saying the Warriors break the chart in terms of how these two generations should look versus each other. So that's kind of my thoughts there. I don't think we didn't get any comments. My hypothesis is this is probably a week off for a lot of people at work. And as someone who's blogged about sports for years, the reality is a big part of our market for viewership is people reading when they're slacking at work. So if you've got the week off of work, you're probably less likely to be slacking and commenting on sports blogs about the Bulls versus the Warriors, or it might just be so obvious that, yes, the Warriors, if we're starting to compare stats between the Warriors and the Bulls, that they just win this round was won in a rout. There's nothing.
Everyone just nodded their head, and that was it. That was their comment.
Yeah, they're like, yes, the Warriors are much better at threes than the Bulls could conceivably be at all. But let's talk a few other things, Brian, and it's kind of your choice as to how much we want to go down this rabbit hole. I'm hoping to turn some more of these into posts. They might not become posts because we're talking about them here. We'll see. But the Bulls versus the Warriors, something else that stood out to me. There's one thing you asked which you're actually wrong about. This is going to be fun.
Oh, wait, if I'm asking, how can I be wrong? There's no wrong questions, Trey, are there? Well, we'll see.
This makes me sad because I think it shows up on Wayback Machine, but when we migrated over from NBAgeek.com to Boxscore Geek, we lost a few articles. And I actually wrote this one before, and I may write it again. The Bulls with Dennis Rodman were not an undersized team.
Right.
The Bulls with Dennis Rodman were actually every single year they won in that three-peat. If we look at playing time versus shooting efficiency, man, I really hope my mic didn't go out. Is
Your
my
mic sounds
camera?
good. Your
Is my
camera's
camera?
out though.
Okay, yeah, I saw the camera go. Apologies for behind the scenes stuff. I have a bunch of stuff plugged in, and so sometimes Skype, if there's a connection lag, will reset your camera, reset your mic, reset your headphones, and when that happens, it means the quality can go down. So if the quality's worse, listeners, apologies. Just know that Skype randomly told Brian and me shut up, and then came back. Okay, so the reality about the Bulls, the 1996 through 1998 Bulls that won the second three-peat with Jordan, they were a really big team. But their trick was they had oversized guards. You know, they had Tony Kukoc, I think I said that right, Scottie Pippen, even Steve Kerr. All of these people were oversized. They were undersized at center, but they were oversized in the smaller positions. So how oversized they were at those smaller positions overwhelmed how undersized they were at the bigger positions, which was like Rodman was being rolled out as a center. He was way undersized, but they easily made up for it with how oversized the guards were. And I would stress in the NBA, if we're talking smart strategies, that is a really good strategy because it's really, really hard to get really talented tall people. It's not as hard to get tall people as you think. There are 7-footers out there, but obviously being 7 feet tall and coordinated, everybody brings up Hakeem, the Dream, Olajuwon. That's why so many, I don't think it works, but so many players go to him for coaching in the offseason because here's this big that was just so versatile. Tim Duncan's the same way. The fact that Tim Duncan can pass the ball as well as he can with as tall as he is, is remarkable. It's way easier to oversize the guards and get players that are, 6'6", 6'7", that can play really well at the small positions than it is to get players that are 7 feet at the tall positions that are good. So that's the Bulls trick. The reality, though, Brian, is the Warriors, even when we factor in playing time, so it's not just that, the lineup of death or whatever.
Oh, this I was waiting for, yeah.
That everybody talks, they are an undersized team. They actually
interesting. Because, see, I think about guys like Sean Livingston, Andre Iguodala, Klay Thompson. They're all kind of like 6'8" guards, so I thought they were kind of the same as the Bulls. But you're saying no, despite that. Even Steph Curry's 6'3" or 6'4", but no, they're short.
Well, Steph Curry's not that big. I mean, he's one place where they lose it. But yeah, if you break down the Warriors and their height and how much they play, it just breaks down to, Draymond Green, we've talked this before. If you look at Dennis Rodman as a defensive center, compared to an average center. And in fact, if we can do this really quickly, Brian, on Boxscore Geeks, if you go to the comparison engine, just enter like Draymond Green, Andrew Bogut, and we'll get that up really quick.
Yeah, let's.
And then I'll try and get you another one really quick too. Okay, so but my point is, if you compare Draymond Green to like an average center in terms of rebounding rates, he is okay relative to defensive rebounds, but not okay relative to offensive rebounds. And then if you look at things like blocks, he's close to average. Steals, of course, he's better. So it's like if you're looking at Draymond Green to come in and be a big in terms of rebounds and blocks, you're giving up a little there. So that is a problem.
I'm a big hater of this strategy, actually, and I want them to have Bogut or Ezeli out there at all times, which Luke Walton has been doing lately. But yeah, but you said you looked at it by the minutes, though, because I know that Rodman didn't always play center. He played a lot of forward as well with other big men in there. But yeah, I guess if you go minute by minute, then I can't argue with it. Well, I want to see the numbers for this now, Dre. I'm really curious.
Then what I was going to say is, then if you go back to you're making it. So I will write this article. But anyway, if you go back in time to like the 1995-1996 season and look at Dennis Rodman, and don't look at his points, but look at like his rebounding, his block. His blocks he was never that good at. But I think that team, the problem is they just kept the other teams from shooting well. But he looks like a big, at least rebound wise. So the real thing that it comes down to is putting in Rodman as a proxy center is fine because he puts up center-like numbers for the things you want him to do. Draymond Green, you put him in at center. I mean, the one advantage he has is he's just so potent, right? He can do everything. I think one thing that I put up is one of his BSG top 10 that I do the weekly column on my top 10 box scores of the week. He made it one week for getting like a 5x5, which, is remarkable. That just shows his versatility. But he is not really, you can't really use him as a fill-in center. You're kind of cheating and saying we're going to give up a few things at the center, but get other things back.
No, and this is my big argument during the whole should they trade Klay Thompson for Kevin Love argument, which I still think is a joke to this day. But the point is, yeah, Draymond Green is great if you play him at center, but he can guard small forwards. Why not just get more big guys in there that can also do big, good big man things.
So
So
to be fair, if Festus and Andrew Bogut just stay healthy and can, even if it's just limited minutes, that they're still rather good. I mean,
yeah.
I'll totally give them that. So, but the point being, the Bulls would outsize this team. That is an interesting
Mm.
fact that I think is important to consider. And the Bulls, I think, would out rebound this team. But that's where it gets really fascinating to me because the Warriors shoot so well. I think I have to dig more into this, Brian, as I mentioned. But an advantage that the Warriors have is if a team is really good at rebounding, but they're a good scoring team, which the Bulls were, and they're playing a good scoring team, which the Warriors are, there aren't as many rebounds to go around. So it's an advantage, but it's kind of minimized by the fact that in a game between these two teams, you're expecting one of two things: either not a lot of rebounds because it's a shooting contest, or a lot of rebounds because one of the defenses is just shutting the other one down.
Well, this is an important point because we're just talking about how big the guys are, but like we say all the time, what you produce is what matters, not what you look like. So that's the part I'd really be interested in, I guess, is how each team's big man stats compare to the league at the time.
So I'm gonna say something that ticks off Brian, and it should probably tick you off even more because
Oh, good.
Patrick and I occasionally like delve into the start of tools or the start of analysis, and we let Brian get first crack at it. He gets to look at it, and then sometimes we get behind at work, and then nothing comes out of it. So we've got a few of these we've got a few tools and things in development that are like 80% of the way through, and me even saying that on the show probably reduces the chance that they get finished as fast as I'd like them to, but we've kind of started looking at cross-generational stuff because it's really hard to compare, for instance, 10 assists from Oscar Robertson in 1975 when the pace
Yeah.
was much faster and teams just turned the ball over a lot more and stuff like that. I mean, the article I linked on last week's show, Brian, or whatever, was about this, where essentially if we look at the state of play in the NBA, and if you've got basketball on paper, pull it out, and there are two brilliant charts that I really wish Dean Oliver would update for the remainder of rule changes for offensive rating and stuff. But regardless, there was a much different game. And so when I'm comparing assists per 48 in 1975 versus assists per game in 2016, it's not the same. So we started looking at things like distributions of how the players in each generation played, and then what you can start playing around with is where on the distribution you would like to compare the two teams. That's actually one reason I really like the 3-point charts, Brian, is just because, as we pointed out, there's kind of a natural schism between the two generations. So it's very obvious to see where the Warriors place next to their generation versus where the Bulls place next to theirs.
Yeah, and you can tell I worded that question really carefully, not to say how did they do versus other teams and versus each other, for instance. But yeah, that's a question I have no knowledge about. So yeah, better make those tools, Dre. It's the only choice.
But I do want to, I do definitely want to look into that to say, okay, here's how the Warriors defend and what they do, right? Because we started that. This article I wrote started that. It said, here's how they do it defending threes. It's a little harder because we don't have shot charts for the 90s, or if we do, they're not as readily available. I'll try and track that down. But that's where you want to start breaking this down. And it's not really possible to make a concrete analysis because other people have pointed out, one of these two teams is going to have to adapt to different rules. And I think that is harder than people give it credit for. Because one of the big rules, you sent me a fantastic Reddit post on this, Brian. If you could please put that in the email you sent me so I remember to include it in the links. It was basically about the illegal defense rule that was the case in the 90s and is no longer the case. The way the illegal defense rules worked is it basically said you had to play man-to-man, you were allowed to use double coverage, but you were only allowed to double cover if the person had the ball. And so the NBA now, what you're basically allowed to do is have someone float if they want. They can float near the key in the paint and go and switch between players if need be. And it's even huge in that you could do things like you could double cover Steph Curry if he doesn't have the ball. That's a hugely different game that would maybe help or hurt Michael Jordan, depending on the era, depending on what we're going to say.
And just for some context, Dre, where all this came from was Ethan Sherwood-Strauss interviewing Steve Kerr about this. Would your team as a player, your team as a coach win? And that's something he said is, yeah, if it's a different era, we couldn't double team Jordan we couldn't flood the strong side, right? So, yeah.
Yeah.
Steve Kerr
So
is the one who said it first.
and then additional, so like that's actually interesting. 'Cause the other point people bring up is like the hand check rule, like how rough you were allowed to be with the ball handler, and how without the hand check rule Jordan would be so much more dominant in the modern era, which might be true, but then in the modern era you're essentially allowed to double team Michael Jordan even if he doesn't have the ball. So that's where this gets really interesting. And so even if we start breaking down the stats, who's good at rebounding, who's good at what, we have to take into account that they're good at these things within the context of the rules. So we're never going to get a finished story, unfortunately.
Yeah, and just to go back to the three-point shooting a little bit, one kind of cross-era thing is, whether or not the Bulls would have the knowledge we do now about how good three-pointers are. Because, one thing that's being talked about for three-pointers is, the line's been around for a long time, but even in the 80s, there weren't very many guys taking them just because players just didn't practice it. They didn't grow up taking them. They didn't know how. It took like a generation of players growing up with it before they started getting good at it to have this, height with Steph Curry. There was a few guys, Larry Bird, Reggie Miller, Chris Mullin, a few others. We were talking about George McLeod and Dennis Scott a little bit later on, but there were, as we can see from those charts, there just weren't a lot of guys taking threes, and they didn't have the knowledge they were good. So that's kind of a question for me, too.
Well, a huge part, and George Karl is an example of this, is that if you have players that grew up playing a certain way, and they become coaches, and now they're trying to tell the team how they're supposed to play, it gets really, really rough when the coach isn't really familiar with that. So I think to your point, yes, it's a generational thing in terms of kids growing up shooting threes, as Mark Jackson says, ruining the game. Love you, Mark Jackson.
And even Greg Popovich, for that matter. What's that about?
Yeah, but so Greg Popovich says that he's ruining the game?
Greg Popovich said a few weeks ago that he hates all the three-point shooting and he doesn't like it, but he has to do it because it's how you win. So he's a little more pragmatic than Mark Jackson.
At least he finishes it up the right way. I mean, I can see that boat where if you start something, you get used to something, you like a certain style of player, a certain game, and it changes on you, and you're like, well, I liked it the old way. I think that's pretty common. The one difference I'll say is if you send me the Greg Popovich quote, I just want to look at it. It sounds like his is saying, things have changed to something I don't like, where Mark Jackson's doing the old man, things have changed, I hate it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But to be fair, Greg Popovich, although he recognizes it, they are not taking a lot of threes this year, the Spurs.
So, they are really interesting. And I think something that there is actually the data out there to look at what I want. I just don't have it readily in a form that I can use yet. And it's kind of what I was talking about. The sports VU era is one of my pet peeves. It's a good thing. It's a good pet peeve. I want to stress this. So as I've mentioned before on the show, the NBA did not start recording things like blocks and turnovers, I think individual turnovers and stuff, until like 1978. We don't have a complete box score for the NBA until 1978. We have like a partially complete one. We can kind of put things together using like wins produced, for instance, from 1974. As I've stated before, any advanced metric that is attempting to incorporate things like, individual players as well as we do now before 1974 just is impossible, not really possible before 1978. So 1978 is like a data cutoff where we just don't have the data we need to do the analysis we would like. And there's nothing we can do to fix that. 2000 is a cutoff where we get the play-by-play and shot chart data. So this is where we can start analyzing, actual play-by-play numbers, actual shot chart data, things that I would love to have for Michael Jordan that we don't. And then basically 2013 or 2014 is when SportsView, which are these cameras that are above every stadium in the NBA, start recording like super up to the minute play-by-play stuff. So we get things like time of possession, number of touches, if a shot was contested. So those things are great.
And only in the last few years have all the teams had it, right? At first it was just a few of the teams. Is that right?
One thing I am absolutely proud of the NBA for doing is that this technology came about and a bunch of teams kind of opted in, and it was trivial. I think Devin wrote an article back in the day about how much it would cost and said like how stupid it is for a team to not invest in it, basically was his logic. But a bunch of teams didn't. And then the NBA just came out and said, you know what, we're making this league wide, everybody gets it. So that was fantastic. But the problem is now we're gonna, it's like if I want to compare Michael Jordan to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to Steph Curry, they each, and then let's say in the middle, LeBron James. Actually, that's a good one. Steph Curry, LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Kareem. These are like four amazing players that I want to compare. They each exist in a different data era where I'm just lacking the data for some of them that I can never do. Like I can never compare, the shot charts between Steph Curry and Kareem, which I would love to do. I can never compare, the play-by-play data for, Michael Jordan versus Kareem, which I would love to do. So that gets really rough, but that's where we're at. And so anyway, we were talking kind of era and all that. Where are we coming from this, Brian? Get me back on track.
Yeah, no, just to finish that off, and of course we have nothing for guys like Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell, but no, we were talking about the defense a little bit. That's what we are on right now, is the difference in the defensive roles. So maybe we're done with that.
And we started with the Spurs. So
yeah.
Wow, that was a really long tangent for this simple point. One thing I will concede in the NBA is an open shot is amazing, and it's really hard to get an open shot in the NBA. As a result, the Spurs, if they're taking mid-range shots, to know if it's a good or bad shot, you have to know if it's open. That's not as readily apparent, although the data is out there. So that's something I would like to start analyzing. Because the Spurs are pretty good about that stuff, about running smart offenses that get open shots or get threes, etc. So clearly their offense is doing well, if I recall. So let's just take a quick look. I'll look that up while I'm talking, Brian. But one last point on the Bulls versus the Warriors that I want to bring up that I think is important and people may not realize. Here's what I'm going to read down. If we look at the Warriors and sort them by minutes played this season, here are their ages. I believe Basketball Reference updates it to the current point in the season. I don't know off the top of my head, though. Okay, Draymond Green is 25 years old. Steph Curry is 27 years old. Klay Thompson is 25 years old. Andre Iguodala, 32 years old. Festus Ezeli, 26 years old. So those are their top five. We're going to go over to the Bulls. Same thing. Michael Jordan, 32. Scottie Pippen, 30. Tony Kukoc, 27. Dennis Rodman, 34. Steve Kerr, 30. So the Bulls, the bulk of their minute players are all older players.
You're leaving out a 40-year-old Blue Edwards? Or no, that's James Edwards. I don't know if
James
that's a different
Edwards. Is his nickname Blue? James Edward, the 13th man on the Bulls team. All right. But anyway, my simple point being, the Bulls team
Buddha was his nickname. Sorry, not Blue. Anyway, continue, Dre. We want to keep this factually correct.
We're going to talk about Buddha Edwards. But the Bulls were a remarkable team, but it is worth noting that this star-studded team came together with a bunch of players past their prime. It's very reminiscent, by the way, of the 2008 Celtics, in that the reason these three players, these players could all come together, Kerr included, I'll actually put Kerr on the list as well, is just because of the circumstances that when you get older in the NBA, your flexibility for movement moves around. Whereas if you want young players together, you pretty much have to draft the players. So, but anyway, my simple point, my last one, this is going to be like my last thing that may turn into an article too, Brian, is the Warriors are much more players in their prime than the Bulls. And also what's worth noting this season that's kind of misleading is just how they're doing minutes restriction. How the Warriors are really effectively managing player minutes, and that the Spurs are the same way. If we're talking strategies that smart teams should copy, the Spurs resting players is kind of caught on too. But yeah, the Bulls gave many more minutes to Pippen, Jordan, and Rodman than the Warriors are giving to Curry, Draymond, Iguodala. So basically, I think that if both of these teams go 100% in a 7-game series, it's even more misleading than the numbers for the season are showing, because the Warriors are resting their players and they're younger than the Bulls players who are older and played more minutes.
And the Warriors are even using wearable technology to measure stresses on their bodies, and when they get to certain numbers, they say, "Oh, time to take a rest." So they're actually using data to time these rests.
Really, that is
absolutely.
I need to read more on that. That would be one thing that would help, because if you listen to one of my complaints in the shows in the past, basically medical data is the hardest. That's what makes it rough.
Yeah.
Right? When a player goes down with a knee injury and is out for the season and comes back the next year, and we're trying to predict how well the team will do, a thing that I've kind of just stopped doing because I've realized just how hard it is, and that people will basically incorrectly use that as an assessment against me. But anyway, all I was going to say about that is that medical data would be huge, and so if some of that starts becoming proprietary, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think the company is named Catapult, I want to say. I think they're an Australian company, and several NBA teams do use them. So, yeah, we'll have to look more into them. Give them a free plug on our show.
Sounds good. All right. So you said you don't have a lot to talk here, and I might not actually even have that much.
No, but
either.
just to finish up on that point, though, the Warriors only have two key players that are in their 30s, Iguodala and Bogut, who are 32 and 31. If we go back over this Bulls chart here, all kinds of guys like Pippen and Kerr are 30, and of course Jordan and Rodman you already talked about. So yeah, big age advantage. That's really interesting.
Well, I mean, it's just it's fascinating to know just how kind of remarkable this Warriors team is for a variety of reasons. And some of it, I mean, I was on the other side, right? If you recall when the Klay Thompson trade was up for debate for Kevin Love, I was on board with it. And I mean, I think one thing that was really important about that trade not happening was kind of the difference in what it would do to flexibility for the team. Klay Thompson with the new CBA is on a very flexible deal that even though it seems high right now, which it is, because I think it's, and I do not have this readily available. Let's see if I can get it in front of me. Klay Thompson is currently the most paid player on the team. That's remarkable, by the way.
Yeah, it's something like 15 million a year.
He's 15.5 million a year, and it basically goes up moderately to 2019. But if we basically look at the salary cap almost doubling, that puts him more into the kind of what we would currently think is below 10 million range. So, I mean, he's probably a little overpaid, but if we factor in his play, his age, his defense, he's probably about market value. But then he also gives a lot of flexibility to the team, and you're not worried about, Kevin Love, who's older, injured, and would command a bigger contract that would probably be like a max. Klay Thompson was a more flexible move. Now, maybe in the future we'll decide it was wrong or right, but right now it's looking like all of those that, Ethan Sherwood-Strauss, who we've mentioned before, who said it's like, all of us that were bashing that no trade at the beginning of the season, we're kind of just, ducking our heads out of the way when it comes up now because we look wrong. And, the Warriors are just kind of in a great spot, both flexibility-wise, young player-wise, all of the stuff, especially given like the market they're in and stuff. So I can only see good things for them going forward versus kind of the Bulls that were this older team of stars that was kind of put together and kind of held together with duct tape and super glue. And we saw as soon as Michael Jordan retired that team, just imploded immediately.
Well, Kevin Love is only 2 years older than Klay Thompson. He's 27. I mean, that's a long time, a lot of years actually for a prime player. And he did come into the year at 19, I think, or something like that. He was a
He came in young, but he's been getting pretty beat up.
A lot of mileage, right?
Yeah. And well, it's just hard to say. I mean, that's what we should stress anytime we start making predictions on major moves, just how big, like this sounds a weird way of putting it, how big the small stuff impacts that, right? Because if you trade for Grant Hill and Grant Hill is healthy, that makes your franchise for, I think they signed him for like 8 years or something at the time. The Magic signed Grant Hill to a really long, really expensive deal, and then he was injured and it never panned out. You sign Grant Hill, like that deal, if a stress factor in his foot is a little more healthy, that's a completely different trade. Same thing with like Klay versus Kevin Love. If Kevin Love is healthy versus Klay being healthy or whatever, that's a huge trade. And so that's what makes it hard is that in the NBA, because individual players, certain players are so important to a team's success, minor things, injury, etc., has such a big impact on them. It's really, really hard to know when it comes to predictions how things are going to look.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So anything else? I'll let you get the last word on Bulls versus Warriors. We can go on to our last topic.
No, not too much. I'm ready for this rebounding and height thing to come in the coming weeks, and that's about it.
All right. So just FYI, I haven't seen the movie yet. I'm actually going right after this podcast to go watch Concussion. But I did want to talk one thing kind of really quick about it, and kind of one of the issues, Brian, I think you and I have actually talked about brain research, the NFL, and all this stuff in general, which is one of the people that's getting, or one of the families that is getting really upset about this movie is Dave Duerson. So Dave Duerson, I believe, was on the benefits committee around the time a lot of this has happened. And a big behind the scenes story of Concussion was just how vehemently the NFL was against admitting that anything was brain damage. My memory's not as good on the concussion history as I'd like, even though I've seen like League of Denial and stuff. There was essentially a player that got benefits approved by the NFL where they admitted that he had brain damage. And then after that, they worked really, really hard to never say that again and really sever the link between brain damage and the NFL just because they realized the can of worms had opened. So I guess in the movie that Dave Duerson is just really getting panned. I'll see it tonight myself and give my own thoughts on it. But a bunch of people that I respect have been saying this. Jeff Pearlman is an example of the person, I plug him like once every couple of weeks. The great book, The Showtime Lakers by Jeff Pearlman. Go to Amazon, buy it. It's like $10 on your Kindle. Anyway, he's come out and said basically that they kind of made Dave Duerson look like a real enemy and, much different than he was in real life, basically in the sake of being a villain in the movie. I'm kind of regurgitating a lot of stuff on the great Cracked podcast that Jason Pargin, aka David Wong, says a lot. But when you're writing a biopic, you can't really always, at least if you're trying to make a script that is like a major Hollywood movie, it's kind of hard sometimes to follow the real facts because it doesn't fit kind of this three-act structure that so many movies have, which is like the double dip structure. Like the hero encounters a thing, they kind of get over it, then things get worse, then they get over it again, and then they win at the end or whatever. Or if they don't win at the end, it goes downhill, and that's a tragedy. So that's the difference between like a success or tragedy movie. Anyway, so a lot of movies that are based on true stories get kind of stretched over this three-act structure, and as a result, certain things get changed. For instance, this is one of the reasons that I think it's Paul or Dave. I can't believe I'm getting the name wrong. I think it's Paul DiPodesto, who was in the Moneyball movie.
Correct. Yeah, he was the right-hand man of Billy Beane at the time.
He was going to be played by Demetri Martin, which would have been amazing, but he actually said he didn't want to be in it because the movie, to make that character work, basically made him an amalgamation of people, kind of squished together years. And so he rightly recognized, he's like, this isn't me. This is you forcing a character kind of near my role to fit, so you can tell this in 2.5 hours instead of the real Moneyball story took place over like 5 years and had lots of characters and lots of different things, and you can't fit that in a 2.5 hour movie. But the point being, Concussion kind of made Dave Dorson a villain, and I'm assuming the reason being the three-act structure. You kind of have to have critical villains at critical junctures in the movie. Bennett Omalu is going to go up against certain things. You're going to have to show it. One thing, I've read way too many spoilers, even though I haven't seen it yet, but like one thing as I've seen is, the classic Hollywood narrative of they really pull in the love story, which I've not seen in any, I don't even see his wife brought up that much in any of like the League of Denial, etc. stuff. So regardless, they kind of had to do this. And the defense people are making, and I always bristle when I see this and want to get careful because we're stats people, is when you kind of say my heart is in the right place, so it's okay if I omit the facts or lie, you end up in a very sketchy area. And even when I'm on the side of things, Concussion's getting a lot of good press. Concussion, people are saying Will Smith gives a great thing. I am glad that a lot of people are bringing this up. When Concussion, the movie makers defend itself and say that they're spiritually true, but that essentially they change facts, and it's not just changing facts to make it work for the movie. If it was just that, it would be a little different. It's when you are changing facts that legitimately are about real people, that's important. A comparison that's kind of trivial in comparison but similar is James Cameron in Titanic had a real person on the boat that basically was shooting passengers trying to get onto the lifeboats. He didn't change the person's name, though, so that person's family went, that guy was real. That guy didn't do that. That guy not only didn't do that, he was a hero because he went out of his way to save tons and tons of people, and I believe died saving people on the Titanic. So when you slander someone's name in a movie in the name of making the movie more compelling, and then you defend that by saying we have a message about player safety that we have to get out, so it's important that we make this a compelling movie, and as a result we need to slander a few people, I can't be on board. So,
well, and also this didn't happen 100 years ago like the Titanic disaster. This just happened a couple years ago. It's pretty fresh in people's minds right now.
Yeah, so it's that is an issue. It's especially when right now also with all of the media around concussion and head trauma, etc. in football, if you're near that, your name's going to get brought up. So if you're portrayed as a villain and your family's still alive, they're going to have to deal with it. To your point, at least in Titanic, and I'm not defending, in fact, I'm adamantly against what Titanic did. At least you're not in the mainstream media, and especially with the Twitter sphere nowadays. The fact of the matter is, if you slander someone on the internet and their Twitter handle is out there, they can be overwhelmed with hate really, really quickly. And I've never had to deal with the large scale thing, so I don't even want to claim that. But even when I make a post about Kobe and 50 Laker fans latch onto that, and I wake up and I have 50 angry messages at me, it's quite overwhelming. And I especially give it, and that's for Kobe, which the magnitude of Kobe compared to brain damage in the NFL is trivial. So for having to put up with that, I think I mentioned in the past, I talked to a friend of mine who is a neurologist, and she had said essentially that it had become so politicized with all the research around CTE that we just weren't getting the truth because it was so politically motivated on all sides. A story that came out recently was the NIH was granting a study on, basically brain damage.
The National
And,
Institute of Health, right, Dre?
thank you, National Institute of Health. Not as well known as the NFL. You've never corrected me on NFL, I've noticed. But so the NFL gave a $30 million donation to the NIH, and they kind of said it's strings free. We're going to trust them to do the research. And then it appears that they basically came in and said, we are not, you can't use our $30 million to go towards that grant. And so it's already in a weird spot, right? Where the money involved, the people involved, all this stuff. We haven't even gotten to this, Brian, maybe in future weeks, but we've kind of talked about Bennett Omalu and how
Right.
even he's a David and Goliath story. A lot of bad stuff was done to him. I don't want to go against him at all. He follows me on Twitter. I think his story is amazing. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that I don't think he went into this as naively as a lot of his interviews portray. I think that when you are a doctor, it is perfectly fine to have the ambition to be famous. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think that, and he's even talked about race, where another doctor who wasn't black or Nigerian might have been able to come in. And I'm right on that too. I don't want to get the wrong. He is a Nigerian doctor.
Nigerian, right.
Thank goodness. All right. So another doctor might have been able to come in with the research he did, and basically the NFL might have given him an institute, and he'd be the head of the institute at this point. There's not a problem with that. But what we should just stress is this is such a big issue that nobody that touches it can avoid the fact that they become launched to a national stage on a huge level. And there's not a problem with that. I have no problem with anybody wanting fame or recognition. We just have to recognize that everybody talking about concussions and brain damage and the NFL is in a largely politicized zone, and that we also have to be careful in the same zone that we don't throw out the truth in the name of, well, this is really important, so it doesn't matter that we're stepping on people's names or doing bad science.
No, those are all great points. And yeah, I mean, even Will Smith, I've kind of made fun of on this show before, that he just really lobbied for this role and wanted to get in there, even though him standing next to Bennett Omalu is kind of ridiculous. Like, he's this massive hulking figure.
Do you have that image? I think I saw one on the
I don't have it with me, but we'll bring one up for the links. But yeah, and of course, we've said before, even though I like your counterpoint here that maybe he's not as naive as he comes off as, he's kind of a goofy, joking guy, which is probably one of the other reasons why he had an uphill fight here. He even made fun of Will Smith's performance of him on the NewsHour, I think earlier this week or last week. So yeah, it's just a really striking contrast. And you're right, all these guys have careers that they're trying to further, and that's great. I mean, it's okay to want to be at the top of your career, and both of these guys have gotten there.
So that was a mouthful. I think we'll definitely probably talk more on Concussion because I'm planning on seeing it tonight. I was debating maybe talking about some Star Wars, but you guys, there's spoilers everywhere. Yahoo has turned into Star Wars Spoiler Central if you go to the Yahoo homepage. So I think I'm good with that. I think I'm good with that for the show, Brian. So do we want to get to shout outs? Do you have any this week?
No, I don't have any shout outs. Let's go straight to yours.
All right, so I have two shout-outs. One is a good one. So Random Name, who has been pretty heavy in the comments lately. Thank you. We appreciate that. And additionally, I wanted to give a particular shout-out because Random Name said, hey, I noticed you do this top 10 box scores of the week, which I do every week. Check for that post on Monday, Tuesday if I'm late. If it's on Tuesday, it means I messed up. But anyway, so on Monday, I release my top 10 box scores of the week, usually about basketball. You can tweet at me, hashtag BSG Top 10. For any interesting ones you see. Otherwise, it's just going to be whatever I think is cool. But tweeted, hey, you do these every week, and with how good the Spurs are playing, you don't really include a lot of Spurs. So I took that to heart, and that is why last week I put Boban on the list. I'm on the Boban train.
Oh, I love him.
Name right. But, for a 14-minute game. So
we have to talk more about him in the future.
Oh, amazing. So, yeah.
Speaking of people looking massive in photos next to other people, he's on that list too.
There is a fantastic video that EJ Fisher sent along to me that I'll try and include in the links of him basically just blocking a shot, and it's not even right. So anyway, there is that. That's the first one. The second shout out I wanted to give is to the American. Let me see. Can you help me out with the name again, Brian? I sent you the link. I want to make sure not to get it right. All right, so it is for the American Economic Association. I wanted to check that because I could have done economist or whatever. So American Economic Association, who in San Francisco this week is having a panel, January 3rd. They are having a sports economics panel, which includes zero sports economists, which is amazing. It does include Daryl Morey, although I think he's getting subbed out for Dean Oliver, who is cool. Brian Burke, Tobias Moskowitz, and Jeff Ma. Jeff Ma, you may remember as the person that said the Portland Trailblazers should not draft Greg Oden, they should draft Kevin Durant. You may also recognize him as one of the people in the book Bringing Down the House about the MIT team that made millions off of blackjack from Vegas, and then portrayed by a white guy in the movie 21 because whitewashing is fun. That was sarcasm. I hope you realize that. So, yeah, this is a, as I mentioned to you pre-show, Brian, a passive-aggressive shout out, as I want to do in the past, basically saying I'm very despondent about the state of advanced stats in basketball because, as I've mentioned before, it's so much ESPN and so much bad math and so many really big voices that are not doing things as correctly as I would like. I know that makes me come off somewhat curmudgeonly, and that is kind of the MO I've put on the net, the way it goes. But, it does get sad when you go, well, ESPN doesn't quite know what it's doing. It's just asking for big names. And, it trusts lawyers who do regression analysis for their regularized plus minus instead of people that actually do regression analysis. So anyway, we've got the American Economic Association, who is, I believe, the biggest meeting of these. I think Dave Barry has mentioned. So, they've had interactions with Dave Barry before. They've had interactions with other sports economists who are, well liked and published, and none of them are talking about sports economics. They went outside the thing. So it just, reminds me of ESPN and reminds me of the state we're in, which is just to say, the advanced stats revolution has not been televised and hasn't really happened. And after all of the excitement a sports fan might have after Moneyball, it's kind of gone the other way. At least that's my opinion. So,
but now, any love for Brian Burke though? He's done some pretty good stuff for the NFL.
So my point on that is Brian Burke, in terms of published sports economics papers, has only had one, and it's with Dave Barry as the lead author. So I don't have any complaints with any of these panelists on their own. This is. As I mentioned, I think pre-show to you, Brian, I don't want to compare these as if they are the same magnitude. A sports economics panel does not compare to these other things that I'm about to say. So I just want that 100% clear disclaimer. But it's when you see talks on like diversity in tech, or when you see talk on sexism in tech, which you and I have seen a lot of at various conferences we've either gone to or seen or been watching along the sidelines, and you look at the panel and it's 4 white guys, or in both cases, it tends to be 4 white guys, and you've got 4 white guys talking about diversity in tech. You've got 4 white guys talking about sexism. It's the same thing here. It's like, I would love to see a panel with Daryl Morey on it or Brian Burke on it. Tobias Moskowitz, I think, has a little closer. He's at the University of Chicago. I think he did actually write an economics textbook. He doesn't really publish on sports economics. That's the important part. Jeff Ma, he's a great panelist. I would love to see any of these 4 people on a panel that had at least 1, preferably 2, probably 3 economists on it that are well published, because this is a economist meeting, right? That's what you would assume. You would assume that you would have people who are well published in this field talking to people in the field. That's a good back and forth. But when you're completely lacking the economists, and in theory you are a association for economists, that seems a little off to me.
That's fair. That's a good point.
That's all I got there. And then hat tip, of course, because Dave Barry, I wouldn't have known about that without him at all. But he pointed that out, and I was like, well, I gotta at least give that a shout out, because come on, get on the ball here.
I will give a shout out to Brian Burke though for the NYT Fourth Down Bot Twitter account that he's helped create. Anytime a team's has a choice to go for it on 4th down, that account will tweet out if they should go for it or not. So, good job, Brian Burke, helping the New York Times with that.
Wow, it's part of the New York Times, but it is not verified. But anyway, I am now following it.
Nice.
That is awesome.
Good searching skills there, Dre.
You gave me the full name. All right. Anyway, that said, that is our show. We will see you in the new year. We'll see how the Spurs and Warriors are doing. If you didn't find us through our site, we are at the boxscoregeeks.com. You can find that at boxscoregeeks.com. No the in front of it. Our show is on iTunes and Stitcher. You can find that as the Boxscore Geeks Show. Subscribe, upvote, all of that jazz helps us. We go live every week on twitch.tv/nerd numbers. We usually tweet it out. I think we forgot to this week, but you'll have to follow myself, NBA Geek, Brian, Boxscore Brian, or Patrick, NBA Geek, on Twitter to find out about that. If you're worried about it, though, we show replays of the show on YouTube under channel Nerd Numbers every week as well. So thanks so much. And last plug for this, if you have a top 10 box score you'd like me to write about on Mondays, tweet at me, Nerd Numbers, use the hashtag BSG Top 10, and it might make it to the list on Monday. With that, we'll see you next week.